What happened to the kid who was supposed to save your family? We all knew my nephew Val was going places, going into university professors to talk physics at 13, while the rest of us had never even stepped foot on a campus. He'd teach his older cousins about their math homework while playing online chess on his phone. By 12, teachers were using him as an example to tell kids from rougher areas that they too could make it. "You are the savior of our family," his parents would say to Val, who was eating dinner while simultaneously color-coding today's notes. He was writing research papers at 14, theorizing on how to make breakthroughs in medicine, and even had our old-fashioned spiritual grandmother half convinced he was an oracle. I remember his mom would invite her friends over just so they could randomly quiz Val and watch him answer anything about anything. I'd sit there feeling dumber than Patrick while Val broke down quantum mechanics in a way we almost understood it. When the Stanford interviewer came to interview Val, his little brother Miguel filmed everything from the stairs, whispering, "That's my brother, that's my genius brother," into his phone for his friends. Val's SAT scores came back literally perfect, and his mom fell to her knees in the kitchen, kissing the paper like she was in church. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday, full ride to Stanford Medical School, and before Val even finished reading it, his mom was on the phone with everyone, the whole neighborhood showing up within an hour with food they couldn't afford and champagne from the gas station. His girlfriend Rebecca's parents drove over in their Mercedes, already discussing venues for the wedding. His dad had spent a month's wages on the party, borrowed the rest from his brother, even hired a mariachi band that had to play in the driveway because the house was so packed. Val's dad started giving this speech about sacrifice and the American dream, holding up the framed acceptance letter like it was proof that everything had been worth it. Val suddenly stood up from the couch where he'd been sitting with Rebecca. He walked straight to her in front of both sets of parents and said, "We're done," loud enough for everyone to hear. Rebecca's face went white. "This whole thing, us, everything, it's over," Val continued, pulling the Stanford letter from his dad's hands and walking out the front door. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone was looking at each other like what the hell happened. Next thing we knew, Rebecca was sobbing, and her parents were blaming her, demanding her to confess what she'd done to make Val quit like that. Suddenly, all the fingers were pointed at her. Even stranger, for 3 days, nobody knew where Val went. He turned his phone off and blocked Rebecca on everything. The Stanford admissions office was calling his mom about enrollment deadlines while she lied that he was sick, buying time for the prayer she didn't believe in anymore. That's when I found him. By accident, 72 hours later at a 24-hour diner 40 miles away, sitting in the back booth with 7 prescription bottles lined up on the table. 8 years old, he said when I sat down, not even looking up from the pills he was counting. That's when they started me on Adderall. I asked him what he was talking about, and that's when he finally revealed it. He had ADHD and needed medication to maintain his super genius academic status, but the medication damaged his insides. It wasn't just Adderall, he said. By 10, his parents were forcing him to take modafinil, then stuff that's not even legal by 13, all to keep him focused. Mom and Dad were sitting right there when my doctor said my liver would fail by 30 if I kept taking the meds. I looked at him with extreme sorrow. You know what Mom said when the doctor warned them? Val laughed, but it sounded like choking. She said 30 years is enough time to establish a practice, and Dad said at least I'd die a doctor. That's when he showed me Miguel's texts, how his little brother had caught him injecting medication directly into his veins because the pills stopped working. The real reason I walked away from everything, Val said, pressing another napkin to his nose, wasn't just that I would be dying, wasn't even that they knew and didn't care, wasn't even how my relationship was arranged by my parents. It was what my little brother showed me the night before the party. He pulled up a video on his phone of Miguel at his desk, books everywhere, and an empty pill bottle in frame. Mom already took him to the doctor, already got him diagnosed with ADHD he doesn't have, and already filled the prescription for the same pills that are killing me. Because if I became a doctor, if I proved the sacrifice worked, then they'd do the exact same thing to him. I stared at him in shock. "We have to save Miguel," he said. I nodded, and we stayed in that booth while the diner filled with truckers getting breakfast. Val spread napkins on the table and started drawing diagrams of our options, while his nose dripped blood onto the paper. He wrote down Miguel's school schedule and circled the times when teachers could notice something wrong. The waitress brought us more coffee, and I saw her stare at the prescription bottles before walking away fast. Val's hands shook as he tried to write, but he kept going, listing every doctor who'd prescribed him pills over the years. By 4 a.m, we had a plan that started with getting Val somewhere safe. He stood up to go to the bathroom and almost fell over, grabbing the booth to steady himself. I paid our bill while Val threw up in the bathroom, and when he came out, his face was gray. The sun was coming up when we finally left, and Val could barely walk to my car. I drove us back to my apartment while Val pressed tissues to his nose in the passenger seat. He passed out the second he hit my couch, not even taking his shoes off. I called my boss and told him I had a family emergency, which wasn't really a lie. While Val slept, I sat at my computer looking up medical abuse and child protective services. The websites were confusing and every article said something different about reporting requirements. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I kept reading, trying to understand what we could actually do. Around noon, Val woke up shaking so bad he couldn't hold a glass of water. I made him eat some toast while he told me about the medications, counting them on his fingers. Adderall since he was 8, then modafinil at 10, then something called armodafinil that wasn't even legal for kids. He rolled up his sleeves and showed me the marks on his arms where he'd been injecting when the pills stopped working. Some of the injection sites were infected, and one was still bleeding a little. I wanted to take pictures, but Val said not yet. We needed official documentation first. We looked up urgent care centers and found one that was open on Sundays. Val threw up twice on the drive there, and I had to pull over both times. The waiting room was full, but when the nurse saw Val's condition, she took us back right away. The doctor's face changed when Val listed all his medications and dosages. She ordered blood work immediately and called in another doctor to look at Val's injection sites. They took vials and vials of blood, while Val sat there shaking. The doctor said his liver function needed to be checked right away and gave us a referral to a specialist. She also said Val needed supervised medical detox because stopping these medications cold turkey was dangerous. While we waited for the lab results, Val borrowed my phone to call Stanford. His parents had been calling them saying he was sick, but Val needed to tell them the truth. The admissions officer sounded confused when Val explained he needed to discuss his enrollment. They scheduled a video call for next week, and Val's whole body shook as he hung up. He knew this could cost him the full-ride scholarship his family was counting on. The lab results came back within an hour, and the doctor's face was serious. Val's liver enzymes were elevated, and there were other markers that showed his body was stressed. She printed out everything and said Val needed to see a hepatologist immediately. She gave us 3 different specialists' names and said this was urgent. I took pictures of every paper, every test result, every referral with my phone. That evening, we were back at my apartment when both our phones started ringing nonstop. Val's mom was calling and leaving voicemails about how we were destroying everything. His dad's messages were angry, saying Val owed them after everything they sacrificed. Val listened to one where his mom mentioned increasing Miguel's dose and threw his phone across the room. It hit the wall, and the screen cracked, but it kept ringing. I texted Val's mom that he was safe, but needed space to get medical help. Her response was instant. Paragraphs about ungrateful children and ruined dreams and destroyed futures. Val read them over my shoulder and pointed out something I hadn't noticed. Not one message asked if Val was okay or what was wrong with him. They only mentioned Stanford and medical school and their reputation in the neighborhood. The next morning, Val could barely get out of bed, but we needed to go to the pharmacy. Val had been getting his prescriptions filled at the same place since he was 8. The pharmacist recognized him and pulled up his records without us even asking. She printed 3 pages of medication history going back to when Val was in elementary school. The dosages started small, but increased every single year, without fail. There were prescriptions from 4 different doctors, which the pharmacist said was a huge red flag. She asked if Val was okay, and he just shook his head. Val remembered that Miguel's school had mandatory reporting rules for suspected abuse. If we could get someone there to notice Miguel's situation, they'd have to report it. But Val was getting worse every hour from the withdrawal symptoms. His nose wouldn't stop bleeding, and he was throwing up constantly. I drove him to the emergency room where they took one look at him and admitted him immediately. The intake nurse said supervised detox from these medications could take days or even weeks. They gave Val a room on the 3rd floor and started hooking him up to machines, while I sat in the hard plastic chair, watching nurses come and go with bags of fluids and medications. The doctor said they'd monitor him for at least 72 hours, which meant I had time to do something about Miguel before things got worse. I left the hospital around noon and drove straight to Miguel's school, my hands shaking on the steering wheel because I knew what I was about to do would change everything for our family. The school secretary made me sign in and get a visitor badge before pointing me down the hall to the counselor's office, where Scott Gonzalez had his name on a wooden plaque next to pictures of students at various school events. Scott was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with thick glasses and a desk covered in papers and coffee cups. I told him I was Val's uncle and needed to talk about Miguel's situation at home, watching his face change from friendly to concerned as I explained about the medications. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing while I talked about Val's liver damage and the prescription bottles and how their mom had already started Miguel on the same drugs. Scott put down his pen and explained he was a mandated reporter, which meant he had to call Child Protective Services within 24 hours if he suspected abuse. My stomach felt sick, thinking about CPS investigators showing up at my sister's house, but Miguel was only 12 and didn't deserve what happened to Val. Scott said CPS would investigate and could require medical evaluations and family services, but the goal was keeping families together while protecting kids. I left his office feeling like I'd crossed a line, but drove back to the hospital where Val was awake and scrolling through his phone with an IV in his arm. He showed me 23 texts from Rebecca asking what was really going on and saying her parents were losing it about the wedding plans they'd been making. Val hadn't answered any of them, but I could see his face looked sad as he read her messages over and over. The next morning, Dr. Thora Allen came to examine Val, a tall woman with gray hair who looked at his medication history with her eyebrows getting higher with each page. She ordered more blood work and an ultrasound of his liver, then sat down to explain that while his liver was still working, it showed clear signs of stress that would have become serious damage if he'd kept taking the medications. She documented everything in his chart and said she'd write a detailed report for his medical records that could be used as evidence if needed. That afternoon, Val's parents showed up at the hospital, demanding to see their son, but the nurse at the desk checked her computer and said Val had put them on the no-visitor list. His mom started wailing in the lobby about being kept from her sick baby, while his dad threatened to call lawyers and sue the hospital for violating their parental rights. Security guards came up from the first floor and stood there while other families stared and nurses whispered behind the desk. The guards walked them to the elevator while his mom screamed that we were destroying the family, and his dad kept saying they'd make us pay for this. That night, after visiting hours, I stayed with Val, even though I wasn't supposed to, and watched him have a full panic attack about who he was without the drugs. He kept saying he could feel his mind getting slower and dumber, and that without being the genius, he was nothing to anyone. His breathing got so bad, the nurse had to give him something to calm down, while I sat there telling him that regular people who don't inject stimulants still have value and purpose. He cried himself to sleep, holding my hand like he was 5 years old again. 3 days later, they discharged Val with a thick folder of paperwork, including treatment plans and referrals to addiction counseling and support groups. We stopped at my apartment so he could shower and change into clean clothes before our appointment at the community clinic with Marina Wu. Val's hands shook as he buttoned his shirt, and he threw up twice from nerves before we even left the apartment. Marina Wu's office was in a building that used to be a bank with thick walls and small windows that made everything feel serious and official. She was maybe 40 with kind eyes, but a professional way of taking notes that made it clear she'd heard stories like ours before. Val showed her the video of Miguel with the pill bottle, and she stopped writing immediately to watch it 3 times. She said she needed to file a mandated report right away and started filling out forms on her computer while explaining this would trigger a CPS investigation within 48 hours. Val asked if Miguel would be taken away, and Marina said removal was always the last option and they'd try family preservation services first. She left to make phone calls to CPS, and that's when Val completely broke down for the first time since everything started. He sobbed into his hands, saying he was destroying his family and ruining his parents' lives, but he couldn't let them do to Miguel what they'd done to him. I held him while he cried about the empty pill bottle in Miguel's room, and their mom already calling him unfocused and lazy, just like she'd done with Val before the medications started. Marina came back with more paperwork and explained that CPS would interview Miguel at the school without the parents knowing first, then investigate the home and require medical evaluations for both boys. She said the investigators were trained to work with families, and the goal was getting parents education and support, not punishment. Val asked what would happen to his parents, and Marina said it depended on their cooperation, but most cases ended with safety plans and services, not criminal charges. We walked out of that clinic into the bright afternoon sun, and Val's phone started buzzing like crazy in his pocket. He pulled it out and showed me the screen. 43 missed calls from his parents and Rebecca, plus texts that kept coming faster than we could read them. Val stared at his phone for a long minute before typing something to Rebecca, just asking if she could meet him tomorrow, because he needed to explain everything. She texted back immediately saying yes and asking if he was okay, but Val just put his phone away, and we drove back to my apartment in silence. That evening, while I was making dinner, Scott called to tell me CPS had already contacted him and would be interviewing Miguel at the school tomorrow morning. He kept reassuring me that Miguel wouldn't be scared or hurt by it, that the investigators were trained to talk to kids in a way that made them feel safe, but I couldn't stop my hands from shaking as I stirred the pasta. I didn't sleep at all that night, just laid there staring at the ceiling thinking about what we'd started and whether we'd made things better or worse for Miguel. The next morning, Val borrowed my car to meet Rebecca at a coffee shop downtown while I waited outside in case he needed me. Through the big window, I watched Rebecca's face change as Val talked, first confused, then shocked, then something that looked like horror, when he must have told her about the injections and liver damage. She stood up at one point, and I thought she was going to walk out, but then she sat back down and reached across the table to take his hand. They sat there for maybe 20 more minutes before they both came out to the car together. Rebecca looked right at me and said her parents had been pushing the whole relationship because they wanted genius grandchildren, that they'd been planning this since she and Val were kids. She was mad about being used like that, but more worried about Val's health, asking if he was seeing doctors and getting help. She told Val she'd support whatever he needed to do, even though they weren't together anymore, and that she was sorry his parents had done this to him. My phone started ringing while Rebecca was still talking, and I saw it was Val's mom calling. The second I answered, she was screaming that CPS had shown up at Miguel's school, demanding to know what we'd done, calling us traitors, and saying we were just jealous of Val's success. I tried to explain, but she kept yelling louder and louder, switching to Spanish curses I'd never heard her use before, so I just hung up. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. About an hour later, Scott called back with an update, his voice calm but serious. He said Miguel had been really cooperative with the investigators, that he'd admitted his parents made him take medicine that made him feel sick, and even showed them a hidden stash of pills he'd been pretending to swallow, but actually hiding in his backpack. Scott said CPS was putting a safety plan in place that meant Miguel couldn't take any more medications without a full medical evaluation from a new doctor first. That evening, I was sitting on my couch trying to process everything when someone knocked on my door. It was Val's dad, looking tired and older than I'd ever seen him. He was calmer than his wife, but still angry, saying we didn't understand the pressure they were under, how they'd given up everything to come to this country, and their kid's success was the only way out of poverty. Val stood up from the couch and told his dad that killing your children for success wasn't success at all. His dad's face got red, and he started saying they did what any good parent would do to make sure their kids had futures, that plenty of parents gave their kids medication to help them focus. Val pulled out the thick folder of hospital paperwork and shoved it at his dad, asking if a good parent would knowingly poison their child. His dad's hands shook as he read through the pages about Val's liver damage, the elevated enzymes, the warnings about permanent organ failure. I watched his face crumble as he kept reading, his eyes moving slower and slower over the medical terms until he finally looked up at Val with tears in his eyes. He admitted they knew about the liver warning from the doctor years ago, but thought he was just being dramatic, that lots of kids took these drugs and turned out fine. He said Val's mom had convinced him it was temporary, just until Val got established as a doctor and could take care of himself. He looked so much smaller standing there in my living room, like all the air had gone out of him, as he realized what they'd really done to their son. Before he left, he mentioned that Stanford had called the house again, asking about Val's enrollment status, and the deadline to confirm was only 5 days away. Val said quietly that he didn't know if he could handle medical school without the drugs, if he was even smart enough without them. His dad looked at him for a long time, and then said something I never thought I'd hear from him, that maybe it was okay if Val didn't go to Stanford, maybe it was okay if he wasn't a doctor after all. The next morning I woke up to knocking on my door and found both of Val's parents standing there looking like they hadn't slept. Val came out of his room still in yesterday's clothes, while his mom pushed past me into the living room carrying a folder thick with printouts. She spread papers across my coffee table, pointing at articles about doctors and lawyers who used Adderall in college. Val sat down across from her while she kept pulling out more papers, showing successful people talking about using stimulants for focus. His dad stood by the window reading each article she handed him, while she kept saying we were being dramatic about normal study aids. She pulled up a website on her phone showing how many college students take these medications and asked Val if he thought they were all being abused. Val picked up one of the articles and pointed to where it mentioned prescribed doses, while showing her the medication history we'd printed with his doses circled in red. His mom pushed the papers away and stood up, saying everything they did came from love and wanting him to have opportunities. She started pacing around my small living room, talking faster and faster about sacrifice and how they gave up everything for their kids. Val's dad tried to calm her down, but she turned on me suddenly saying I was just jealous because my own life didn't amount to anything. The words hit me hard, but before I could respond, Val stood up and told her I was the only family member who actually cared if he lived past 30. His mom's hand moved so fast I barely saw it before the slap connected with Val's face. The sound echoed in the room, and everyone froze for a second before she reached for him, saying she didn't mean it. Val walked straight past her and out the front door without a word. I followed him outside where he was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands and blood dripping from his nose onto the sidewalk. He pressed tissues against his face while I sat down next to him, not knowing what to say. His mom came out a few minutes later with tears running down her face and knelt down in front of Val. She kept touching his shoulder and saying she didn't mean for this to happen, while Val kept his eyes closed. She was crying harder now, saying she just wanted him to have opportunities she never had growing up poor. Val finally looked at her, and she gasped, seeing how pale he was with blood still coming from his nose. She helped him stand up, and we all went back inside, where Val's dad was sitting at the table with the medication history spread out in front of him. He was counting on his fingers and writing numbers on a napkin while going through each page of prescriptions. He looked up at his wife and asked if she knew about Val injecting the medications when the pills stopped working. She sat down heavy in the chair and admitted she suspected something when she found needles in his room, but didn't want to know for sure. Val pulled out his phone and showed them Miguel's video again, with their younger son at his desk, surrounded by pills. His mom started sobbing when Val said this was their chance to do better with Miguel before it was too late. She reached into her purse and pulled out a prescription bottle with Miguel's name on it, saying she'd already bought next month's supply. Val's dad took the bottle from her hands and walked to the kitchen where he poured all the pills down the sink. 2 days later, we were all sitting in a conference room at the CPS office, waiting for the investigator to arrive. Miguel was there too, looking small in the big chair next to his parents, who kept whispering to each other in Spanish. The investigator came in with a thick file and started explaining the safety plan they were putting in place. Miguel would stay with his parents, but any medications had to be supervised by a new doctor who specialized in child development. The parents would have to attend weekly education classes about child development and the risks of prescription stimulant abuse. There would be monthly check-ins with a social worker to make sure the plan was followed. The investigator was firm, but not mean, as she explained that this was about keeping Miguel safe while keeping the family together. She asked me to step into another room where she interviewed me about being a safety resource for Miguel. I agreed to be someone he could call if he felt pressured or unsafe, and gave her my work and cell numbers. When we went back to the main room, Miguel hugged me tight and whispered that he was scared, but glad the pills were stopping. Later that week, Val had his Stanford video call scheduled, and he asked me to sit nearby for support. He set up my laptop at the kitchen table and logged in 5 minutes early with his hands shaking slightly. The admissions officer appeared on screen looking professional, but confused about why Val had requested this meeting. Val took a deep breath and started explaining everything about the forced medications since he was 8 years old. He showed them the hospital paperwork about his liver damage and talked about his current withdrawal and treatment needs. The admissions officer's face changed from confused to shocked as Val kept talking about the medical abuse. She was quiet for a long moment after Val finished, before saying she needed to discuss this with the committee. She said they'd never had a situation like this before and would need to review his medical documentation carefully. The call ended with her saying they'd be in touch within a week about their decision. That same afternoon, Dr. Allen called with her completed medical report for Stanford. She said Val needed at least 6 months of treatment and recovery before he could safely handle the stress of medical school. She recommended a gap year minimum, but said with proper treatment, Val could still pursue medicine if he wanted. Val seemed relieved when I told him what she said, like he finally had permission to slow down. The next day, Rebecca's parents called Val asking for a meeting to understand what happened at the party. Val agreed, but asked me to come along for support, which I was happy to do. We met them at a coffee shop downtown where they were already waiting in a back booth looking serious. Rebecca's mom started asking questions immediately about why Val had broken up with their daughter so publicly. Val explained about the medical abuse and showed them some of the documentation about his liver damage. They looked shocked, but Rebecca's mom kept bringing the conversation back to how this affected their daughter's reputation. She said people were talking about Rebecca being dumped, and it was embarrassing for their family. Val apologized for the public breakup, but said he wasn't thinking clearly after years of forced medication. Rebecca's dad seemed more concerned about whether Val would still become a doctor, since they'd been planning a future together. Rebecca suddenly stood up and looked straight at her parents and told them she was actually glad the relationship was over because she wanted to pick her own boyfriend someday. Her mom's mouth opened to argue, but her dad put his hand on her arm and said maybe they all needed to think about what success really meant if it was making everyone miserable. Rebecca walked around the table and gave Val a quick hug before leaving with her parents, and I heard her tell him she hoped he'd get better as they walked out. The next morning, Val had his first appointment at the outpatient therapy center downtown, where they specialized in addiction recovery and trauma. The therapist was this older woman who took notes while Val explained about the pills since he was 8, and she said it would take months just to figure out who he really was without all those drugs in his system. Val's hands were shaking when he signed up for 3 sessions a week plus group therapy on Saturdays. A week went by, and then Miguel had to go see a new doctor for his independent medical evaluation that the court ordered. The pediatrician ran a bunch of tests and checked Miguel's grades and talked to his teachers and found 0 evidence that he had ADHD or any learning problems at all. She actually said Miguel was doing better than most kids his age without any medications and recommended he see a therapist just to talk about everything that happened, but otherwise he was totally healthy. Val's parents had to start their mandated parenting classes that same week at the community center, with about 15 other parents who'd been ordered there by the court. His mom texted Val after the first class saying she couldn't believe how many other parents were there for giving their kids prescription drugs, and she had no idea this was such a big problem. The instructor had shown them videos about what stimulants do to developing brains, and Val's mom said she felt sick watching it. 3 days later, Val was sitting at my kitchen table when his phone rang with a Stanford number, and his whole body went tense. The admissions officer said the committee had reviewed everything, and they were offering him a 1-year deferral where he could keep part of his scholarship if he reapplied next year with medical clearance, showing he was healthy enough for the program. Val started crying right there at my table. Not sad tears, but relief that the door wasn't completely shut on everything he'd worked for. The financial stuff hit his parents hard the next week when they realized the full ride was gone and they'd have to pay back all the loans they took out, thinking Val would be making doctor money soon. His dad was mad at first and yelled about wasted sacrifices, but then he went and got a second job at a warehouse and told Val maybe working for something real instead of borrowed dreams would be good for them. Rebecca sent Val this long text message a couple weeks later, saying she'd talked to her parents about all their pressure, and they were starting family therapy as a family to work through their own issues. She said Val walking away had actually freed her too, because now she was applying to art school instead of the business program her parents wanted, and she thanked him for showing her it was okay to choose your own path. Val smiled when he read it to me, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks, not forced or fake, but actually happy about something. 3 months passed, and Val got a part-time job at this bookstore near the university to help with expenses and give his days some structure while he was in recovery. He told me his brain felt different now, maybe slower than before, but also clearer, like he could actually see things without the drug haze making everything urgent and intense. His manager at the bookstore said Val was their best employee because he actually cared about helping customers find the right books instead of just trying to sell them stuff. Miguel was doing amazing without any pills, joining the soccer team at the school and making actual friends who liked him for being funny and good at soccer, not just for being smart. He still got good grades, but now he also got to be a normal kid who played video games and rode his bike around the neighborhood and didn't spend every night studying until midnight. He told Val one day that he was grateful every single day that his brother saved him from ending up sick like Val had been. Val's grandmother finally came to visit after everything calmed down, and she said she'd had a dream where Val's path changed directions but didn't disappear, just went somewhere different from expected. She brought all this stuff for a spiritual cleansing ritual with candles and herbs and prayers in Spanish, and Val actually participated, even though he'd never paid attention to that stuff before when he was too busy studying. She burned sage around him and said prayers while Val sat there with his eyes closed, and afterward he said it felt good to connect with something from their culture that he'd been too focused to notice before. The next few weeks brought paperwork from CPS saying they were switching our case to voluntary services since Val's parents were actually following through with their required classes. Val's mom sat at our kitchen table one afternoon, filling out progress reports while telling me she never realized how much fear she'd been carrying about staying poor forever, and how she'd pushed that fear onto her boys. The social worker came by to check on things and seemed happy that Val's parents were showing up to their joint therapy sessions every week without missing any. Val had been doing better with his withdrawal, but then one morning I found him on the bathroom floor crying so hard he couldn't breathe. His whole body was shaking, and he kept saying he wanted to die, that his brain felt broken without the pills. I drove him straight to the emergency room where they admitted him for severe depression that the doctor said was totally normal for someone coming off years of stimulants. They kept him for 4 days, adjusting his medications and monitoring him while I called out of work to stay there. The psychiatrist explained that Val's brain had to relearn how to make its own chemicals after depending on drugs for so long. When Val got discharged, he seemed different, calmer, but also kind of lost, like he didn't know who he was supposed to be anymore. He started going to the community college just to sit in on classes without any pressure to perform. First, it was a philosophy class where the professor was talking about identity and purpose, then a literature course about American writers. Val would come home excited about books he'd never had time to read before, talking about ideas instead of test scores. The philosophy professor pulled him aside one day and told him his comments in class showed real insight, not just memorized facts, but actual thinking. 6 months after everything started, Marina set up a family meeting at her office to figure out where Miguel should live permanently. We all sat around this big table while Miguel said he felt safe with his parents now, but liked spending weekends at my place for backup. Everyone agreed that made sense, and his parents signed papers saying I'd be his emergency contact and weekend guardian. Val's mom had been going to therapy twice a week and finally got that promotion at work she'd been wanting for years. She told us she was proud of something she'd earned herself without using her kids as trophies. Val's dad had started coaching youth soccer at the community center and seemed happier than I'd ever seen him, working with kids who just wanted to play. When Miguel's team made it to the championship game, we all went to watch him play without anyone mentioning grades or college scholarships even once. Miguel scored the winning goal in the last minute, and his parents jumped up cheering just because their kid was happy, not because it would look good on applications. Val and I looked at each other across the bleachers with this careful hope that maybe things were actually changing. A few days later, Val had his 6-month checkup with Dr. Allen, who ran all these tests on his liver function. She showed us the results on her computer screen, where the numbers had improved way more than expected. She cleared him medically for Stanford if he wanted to go, but warned him to never touch stimulants again and to watch his stress levels carefully. Val sat there staring at the clearance letter for a long time before saying he wanted to wait another 6 months to make sure he was really ready. He'd started volunteering at this youth center downtown, teaching kids from families like ours about academic pressure and mental health. The director told me Val had this amazing ability to connect with kids who were struggling because he'd actually been there himself. One afternoon, Rebecca walked into the bookstore where Val was working, and they ended up getting coffee at the place next door. She showed him her portfolio for art school, and he pulled out these philosophy essays he'd been writing just for fun. They both laughed about how their parents had been planning their wedding when they were just teenagers trying to survive. Rebecca said she was grateful Val had walked away because it freed her to find her own path, too. A week later, Stanford sent an official letter confirming Val's enrollment for the next fall with modified scholarship terms that meant he'd need some loans. Val said earning his education felt completely different from having it forced on him by parents who saw him as an investment. He was thinking about psychiatry now, instead of general medicine, because he wanted to help kids like him and Miguel, who got caught in their family's dreams. 3 weeks later, Miguel's teacher called the house about an essay he'd written for English class about heroes. Val's mom put it on speaker while we all sat around the kitchen table, and the teacher read parts of it out loud, saying Miguel wrote about Val saving his life by walking away from Stanford and standing up to everyone, including their parents. The teacher sounded worried, but Val's parents told her it was all true, and they were in family therapy now, working through everything as a family. She said she was recommending Miguel for this youth leadership program at the community center because his essay showed real courage and understanding. Miguel grabbed the phone and thanked her while Val ruffled his hair, both of them smiling for real this time. Almost a year after that crazy party where Val walked out, we had another gathering at the house, but this time it was just us. Maybe 15 people total who actually cared about Val as a person. No mariachi band, no borrowed money, just some food Val's mom cooked and a cake from the grocery store. Val stood up and read his Stanford acceptance letter out loud, calm and steady, without that frantic energy from before when he was high on stimulants. His hands weren't shaking and his nose wasn't bleeding, and he actually looked healthy for the first time in years. A few months into therapy, Val's parents decided to apologize publicly to both their sons at this support group meeting for parents. They stood up in front of 30 other parents and took full responsibility for the medical abuse without making excuses or blaming poverty or culture. Val's mom joined this advocacy group for immigrant parents and started going to other meetings to talk about the pressure to push kids too hard. She was actually good at it, connecting with other moms who were doing the same thing to their kids, showing them Val's medical records and what happened to his liver. The week before Val was supposed to leave for Stanford, he started packing in his room with Miguel, helping him fold clothes and organize books. Val had this whole support team set up now with his therapist, his sponsor from the recovery program, and Dr. Allen monitoring his health. Miguel kept joking that he'd preserve Val's room exactly how messy Val left it, throwing socks at him and laughing about how Val used to color code everything when he was on Adderall. The night before we drove him to Stanford, our whole family had dinner together at the house, really together without anyone performing or trying to impress anybody. Miguel talked about his soccer team making playoffs, and Val admitted he was nervous about starting school without the drugs that made him superhuman. Their parents just listened without jumping in to fix things or give advice, and even grandmother said this felt like what family was supposed to be. The next morning, I drove Val to Stanford in my car, while his parents followed in theirs, all of us quiet and nervous about this new beginning. We met with the Disability Services Office, where this counselor explained all the accommodations Val could access as someone in recovery. They had support groups, modified testing schedules, and mental health resources specifically for students dealing with addiction recovery. Val signed up for everything, saying he was scared but ready, and I believed him because this time he was choosing it for himself, not being forced by parents who saw him as an investment. 3 months into his first semester, Val called me on a Tuesday night, excited about getting a B+ on his anatomy exam without any stimulants or study drugs. He said it was harder than when he was on Adderall, but it felt real, like he'd actually earned it with his own brain, even if it wasn't perfect. His parents congratulated him on the phone, without mentioning it should have been an A or comparing him to other students. Meanwhile, Miguel was thriving in 8th grade, playing soccer 3 days a week and getting mostly B's with some A's, just being a regular kid with regular problems. Val drove down once a month to visit, and they'd play video games for hours, trash-talking each other and eating too much pizza like normal brothers. Their parents kept going to therapy every week and slowly started understanding that their kid's worth wasn't about grades or achievements or saving the family from poverty. The family wasn't perfect, and probably never would be, but at least it was honest now, everyone trying to do better without pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Thanks for letting me poke around these questions with you today. Really hope my little wonderings were worth your time. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.